Good morning, everyone. I am deeply honored to be invited to address the Jamaica Stock Exchange on the topic Leveraging Digital Transformation for Capital Markets Development, Closing the Digital Divide. I also want to thank the JSC for its vision in playing such a consistent role over the years in fostering discussion on broadband access and connectivity in Jamaica and around the region. Now, in the context of discussions on digital transformation, there are broadly two spheres of analysis which are critical to our understanding of the current state of play in the Caribbean. The first sphere is largely concerned with strategies for taking advantage of the technology to unleash economic potential and supercharge the region's innovation and entrepreneurial capacity. This is clearly an important discussion, but it assumes that questions about the availability of the technology have been fundamentally resolved, or that the pace of digitization can be sufficiently delinked from the question of connectivity. But the reality is that the pace of digitization is inextricably linked to the second sphere of analysis, which is about the access to the technology and investment in the very infrastructure that makes digitization possible. In short, it is about getting people connected to the internet, and this is my concern today. Now, although COVID-19 has given fresh urgency to this second issue, the debate about how to get more people connected is not new. It has been going on for several years, and part of the reason for this is that progress in the region has been slow. For me, therefore, a fundamental question is, how do we get more people connected to the internet? And what are the impediments to that goal? How do we literally bridge the divide between those people in the region with a broadband connection and those people without? What has been the experience of the region in trying to get people online, and what are some of the best practices that have worked? What are the strategies that have not? As the chairman of a regional association of telecoms operators and ICT companies from over 40 countries, and as the current head of regulatory affairs for Cable and Wireless, who was also a former regulator, I have had the privilege of observing the region's digital journey from multiple vantage points. Those positions in both private and public sectors offer me what I think may be a unique perspective on why the region is lagging behind other parts of the world. In short, I thought I could share some insight into why the pace of the region's digital transformation has been slow by identifying some of the roadblocks and point to what are some of the changes we might consider to improve outcomes. My basic thesis is that there is a profound disconnect between what regional governments say are their aims for broadband in their countries and the policies our governments have actually adopted in the telecoms arena. This disconnect, or lack of coherence between policy and outcomes, is arguably most evident in four glaring structural encumbrances which have historically impacted operators' capacity to invest. And although they do not provide a complete explanation for why we are where we are, they have also traditionally received less serious consideration in regional debates on the issue. Now, the first of these is that telecoms operators in the Caribbean and Latin America are confronted in 2021 with largely outdated regulatory models. Initially established to liberalize markets in the late 90s, these regulatory systems focused heavily on controlling monopoly power. They have largely relied on traditional ex-ante sector-specific rules, which are targeted at forcing incumbents to provide access to their networks to competitors. By lowering barriers to entry, these laws aim to secure seamless communication among multiple network operators. They have relied on traditional rules to achieve competition, including on interconnection and access to facilities, infrastructure sharing rules, price regulation, and quality of service guarantees, among others. Nearly every market has also established universal service funds with the aim of promoting investment in underserved or economically unfeasible areas. Almost all of these measures were focused on the fixed network and specifically on exercising market discipline over voice services. However, most of these rules were developed before the advent of convergence, meaning they were developed while the internet was still in its infancy. Without a doubt, these rules did not anticipate the emergence of edge or over-the-top providers in the markets or their impacts on competition. Some 20 years or more Since most of the Caribbean achieved liberalization, these regulatory models are now like a strange, unwanted inheritance, agnostic of the incredible changes that advances in technology have brought. Despite several technological revolutions in just the first few years of the new century alone, telecoms legislation in most of the Caribbean has remained fundamentally the same as it was in the 20th century. Not a single government or regulatory authority in the English-speaking Caribbean has seen it fit to reform their telecoms acts to take account of new realities in the last decade. Not one single government in the region has contemplated radical overhaul of their telecoms regulations to take account of changes in how services are now delivered or consumed. In a few cases where some conservative reform is contemplated, little substantive change is proposed. For example, rules on licensing in the Caribbean seem fossilized or permanently preserved in amber. In the age of VoIP technology, a transition from 2G to 5G, the rise of Facebook, Netflix, WhatsApp, and YouTube, and of global billion-dollar operators, licensing regimes in the Caribbean remain fundamentally the same as when voice calls were only possible via traditional circuit switch technology. Processes for acquiring spectrum remain steadfastly bureaucratic, and regulatory authorities are increasingly attempting to adopt measures to enable regulators to tell the private sector how their own networks should be managed. Telecoms operators are suffering under these outdated regulatory regimes. Simply put, these rules make it harder to compete. They increase the cost of doing business. They stifle operators' ability to innovate and keep pace with competitors. They slow commercial decision-making down, and they disincentivize risk-taking. But perhaps most importantly, they discourage investment. Now, the second structural obstacle to investment in broadband in the region relates to a systemic inequality in the public policy treatment between network operators on the one hand and edge or so-called over-the-top providers on the other. Now, while network operators continue to be shackled with a range of hard regulatory constraints and models, OTT operators have been able to flourish in a largely unregulated or underregulated ecosystem. The consequence has been a transferal of wealth and value away from network operators to edge or OTT providers. This transference of wealth and value away from the network has had and will continue to have dire consequences for the capacity and willingness of operators to invest in network infrastructure and increase and improve access. There have been two equally devastating impacts of the emergence of these services. First, network providers have been compelled to increase investments in the existing network to keep pace with demand. And second, they have been forced to simultaneously reduce prices for services in order to stay relevant. In other words, network operators in Jamaica and elsewhere have gone into greater and greater debt in the last decade in order to build the networks that companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook have used to acquire their wealth. In the words of Dr. Mark Jameson, professor of economics at the University of Florida and chair of the Public Utilities Research Center of the same university, such large network investments drain resources from network providers and pump up the financials of companies that build businesses on top of the networks. This is not an argument about them or us. Edge providers are here to stay. Operators must find a way to work with them. But given these circumstances, the question we all must confront is whether the asymmetrical regulation of these two categories of providers is hindering expansion of the network in underserved or rural communities at a pace which is acceptable to public officials. The third structural challenge relates to how the industry is taxed. Put simply, evidence suggests that the telecoms industry in the Caribbean and Latin America is among one of the most highly taxed in the world. In fact, there is fairly strong evidence that the industry is certainly among the most highly taxed in their own markets. In this regard, the situation in Jamaica is instructive. Overall, telecoms companies and consumers bear a very heavy tax burden in Jamaica. For instance, the corporate tax rate paid by telecoms operators in Jamaica is 33%, which is among the highest in the world and has remained unchanged over a 30-year period. For context, the average corporate tax rate worldwide is just 23%, in the US 21%, and across Europe just 20%. Telecoms consumers in Jamaica also bear a disproportionate tax burden, where the GCT on telecom services and devices is 25%, whereas the GCT on non-telecom products and services is just 16.5%. The effect of these policies is that specific taxes of telecoms in Jamaica are among the highest across all of Latin America. It is perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that in a joint study by GSMA and the consulting firm Deloitte, researchers discovered that more than half, that is 55% of all telecoms operators' revenues in Jamaica, go toward the payment of taxes, and they are paid both by consumers in the form of the 25% GCT and telcos in the form of a 33% corporate tax, import duties, and various per-minute call taxes on domestic and international calls. For comparison, across all of Latin America, the study finds the average tax burden borne by telcos and consumers and operators is 25%, or less than half of the 55% tax burden in Jamaica. Unsurprisingly, this study by GSMA and Deloitte finds that this heavy tax burden is impacting the affordability of mobile services in Jamaica. The situation is further compounded by the fact that, for reasons which are completely understandable, given Jamaica's fiscal challenges, universal service funds collected by successive governments in Jamaica have not been utilized to subsidize network rollout or to support affordability programs for the poor and disenfranchised, so as to give them publicly subsidized access to the network. Accordingly, while the taxes used to raise the levy contribute to making the cost of the services higher, customers and the industry have not been able to benefit from the money raised. In ideal circumstances, where Jamaica had the fiscal space, universal service funds could be a powerful tool to promote digital equality and empowerment and supercharge digital transformation. None of what I've said is intended to castigate the government of Jamaica for its tax policy on telecoms. The economic challenges faced by Jamaicans are vast and real. Rather, my intention is to say that given where we are at, it may be time to consider whether a different approach would be more helpful in solving the problems of connectivity. The fourth and final structural impediment is typically underestimated, but is a critically important part of the connectivity puzzle. It relates to the question of demand. Current political thought and discourse in the Caribbean posits that the primary obstacle to true digitization and narrowing of the digital divide is largely an issue of supply. In effect, the suggestion is that there is simply insufficient offshore capacity and insufficiently robust networks that are geographically ubiquitous and affordable. As a result, political discussions around the development of the ICT sector in the region tends to be focused on the two central issues of accessibility and affordability. Accordingly, there is a reflexive assumption that there is an insufficiency of both, or in other words, that there remain huge gaps in the supply of high-speed affordable broadband. Of course, no one disputes that penetration rates in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean could be higher compared to metropolitan countries. But the debate about supply-side constraints also ignores a key factor impacting network rollout and affordability, which is demand. Policymakers in the Caribbean tend to reflexively assume that all consumers everywhere, in every community, see the value of a broadband connection and have a desire for broadband in their homes. As a corollary of that, the overwhelming assumption by policymakers and civil society is that operators have not done enough or are failing in their obligations to extend high-quality broadband networks to the communities that need them most. But the fact is that, throughout the region, the value and necessity of having a broadband connection in the home is not always obvious. In Jamaica specifically, data from Statin indicates that less than 50% of households have a computer and just over 50% of households have access to the internet. Whether because of the high cost of devices or other factors, including general standards of living, education, per capita income, and a paucity of the availability of government services online, not all consumers place the same value on having a broadband connection as their governments do. And while this should never be an argument for complacency and does not alleviate the urgency for continued investment in broadband networks in countries like Jamaica, it does point to the need for policy interventions on government's part to stimulate demand for the services, which we all believe are important and necessary to our economic advancement and empowerment. To make real progress, all of us need to focus on promoting discussion about what policies would materially improve and increase demand for these services, especially in rural and poor communities. Now, taken together, therefore, these four issues represent significant structural impediments to the spread of high-speed, high-quality, affordable networks in our countries. Indeed, none of us should be surprised that the Caribbean and Latin America lags behind other regions in the world in terms of broadband availability. And while they do not sufficiently explain or excuse the current status quo, it is equally true that they have been major contributing factors to the slow pace of progress. The fact remains that government's policies in all of these four areas have had a material and highly damaging effect on the potential of the private sector to help regional governments realize their own policy goals. But it is clear that the challenges of leveraging digital technology are not solely market-oriented. They are not purely a private sector responsibility. They also represent a failure of public policy and imagination, because there is a mismatch between what governments say they want to achieve and the policies they actually employ. In short, there is a gaping maw between what we want and what we are actually doing. Until we can reconcile ourselves to that fact, the Caribbean will struggle to catch up to the rest of the world and close the digital divide, and the region's digital transformation will continue to be a slow and plodding process. We can all fully understand how difficult this will be. Addressing any of the four obstacles to progress I've discussed will take resolve and creativity. None of the work involved is easy. Just consider the issue of taxation, for example. It is beyond doubt that the current tax burdens on the telecoms industry are unsustainable. But as developing economies, many states in the region are highly dependent on tax revenues, including high import duties and taxes to meet the costs of the public services and to service debt. Clearly, reforming tax policy to lighten the burden carried by the telecoms industry as a way of incentivizing investment in broadband networks is no easy ask. But if governments want to see different results with respect to digitization, then they must be prepared to pursue different strategies. By reforming legislation to reduce bureaucracy, rebalancing the terms of engagement with OTTs, lowering the taxes on the industry and consumers, using universal service funds to subsidize network rollout and support affordability programs, reducing the high cost of end devices, and focusing on ICT technology earlier and more aggressively in schools, governments can and will have a dramatically positive effect on the trajectory of national digitization efforts. By adopting pro-telecoms policies, they can dramatically encourage the sorts of investments necessary to supercharge a country's digital transformation. At all costs, governments in the region must avoid the seductive course of trying to resolve the problems themselves by, for example, constructing their own networks and bypassing existing private infrastructure. While public anxiety about the gaps in the provision of broadband services is understandable in light of the pandemic, international precedent on direct government intervention suggests that these approaches simply do not work. Indeed, evidence from multiple jurisdictions has proven time and again that such measures would result in exorbitant public spending and create duplicate infrastructure that would ultimately become a burden on the public purse. Above all, such efforts would set the journey toward digitization back by several years, chilling investment by private firms, and ultimately undermine the larger goals which government hope to achieve for the sector. What would be preferable would be to identify resources necessary to subsidize the extension of existing networks and setting clear benchmarks for performance, quality, and access. In that way, collaboration with the private sector can help government fill the gaps without taking on the awesome responsibility of becoming a telecoms operator themselves. What is now required is not acting in silos or taking unilateral action, but a new focus on partnership between governments and operators to identify strategies that help achieve policy aims without causing undue harm to the very private sector interests that facilitate them. In that regard, I believe there is cause to be optimistic. The pandemic has given us an opportunity to take a fresh look at the challenges inherent in ensuring people everywhere are connected. It has prompted us to all agree that fixing the problem is urgent and requires different thinking than before. And there is finally consensus that it can't be solved by any one party acting on their own. In the circumstances, I think it's fair to say that we are in a better position to deal with these issues than we have ever been before. I want to thank the JSC again for the honor of having addressed you, and I wish you a good conference.